I'm Vipin Maini. I'm a resilience and growth coach. I grew up in a little suburb in Birmingham called Hall Green, and we lived in a little semi-detached house with, well, we did at the beginning, and had, oh gosh.
Just stop and go again.
I grew up in a suburb in Birmingham called Hall Green with my brother and my mother and father. We are, well, I'm second generation Indian immigrants. My parents came from India. My dad came when he was 19. He worked solidly all the time, 7 days a week, basically trying to secure his future and secure our future is what he was saying. It was pretty, well, I thought it was pretty average. It was growing up, we based from Indian heritage, we were led to believe and told to study hard, so that was really important. So most of my time was, a lot of time spent studying, but my father had a passion for sport. So whereas a lot of Indian children at that time just studied, we also did a lot of sport. My father really encouraged us to play football and cricket. Those were two sports we did a lot of growing up. In fact, he wanted to send us to school that did a lot of that. So he wanted us to study a lot, but sport also played an important role in our well-being. Dad was an immensely strong character and very determined, and came from nothing. So I guess a lot of Asians who came from the subcontinent came to better themselves, and my father was one of those. As a 19-year-old on a boat from Punjab, he left to come over to Liverpool. Arrived in Liverpool, then landed in Birmingham in the end. First few years he worked in a steel factory. I don't know if anyone's ever watched Peaky Blinders. I love that program, one of my favourites. One of the reasons being it's set in Birmingham, and it's set in those areas where my father lived, in Sparkhill, Sparkbrook, Borsall Heath. Those are the areas where he settled initially and worked, and spent his first few years working in a steel factory, and then saved enough had an idea he was going to go into business, so he set up a clothing business basically. And he worked bloody hard to set that up. So I grew up in the 70s, at a time when it was still being accepted by I can't say British people. Yeah, I guess. Did I view myself as British? Not really. But so let's just say being accepted by the indigenous white hosts was a problem, frankly. Yeah. Everywhere we went, or I went, I felt very nervous and on edge, basically. I always felt different, and people looking at you. It's not like today, which has changed so much. No one bats an eyelid. In those days, if you left your town of Birmingham, or even certain parts of Birmingham, you were seen as different. So I went to school in Solihull, for example. There was no non-white people there in the 70s and 80s. Very, very few. So in my class, I was a class of 1 out of 25. And there was all these stereotypes. Those stereotypes were painful. Very painful. And so growing up was awkward. That's why I felt awkward and on edge. Is probably a good summary. Race played a huge part in my growing up. Every day at school, even the teachers.
Right.
Yeah. So that I don't know if it was on purpose or ignorance, but huge amounts, frankly, huge amounts. But yeah, there was a lot of abuse with the boys. Always a lot of fighting. Always even going to local shops was a problem. And just going to get milk was a problem because I was on edge. Because I remember trying to walk to the shops, and if I saw a group of boys, I sort of braced myself, clenched my fists, because frankly I was going to get called names So do I go past them or do I cross the street and show that I'm scared? What do I do? Every day I'm faced with these problems. Every day. So my father, my parents, they wanted to fit in. They desperately wanted to fit in. And their philosophy was always one of non-violence. And they were not violent people and suffering abuse. So there was a big difference between how the white British people viewed black people and Asian people. And I think that was epitomised in the 70s with the rise of the National Front and the rise of the skinhead cult, and it was called Paki bashing. I mean, let's not skirt around the bush here. And why was it called Paki bashing? Because typically a Southeast Asian boy was not meant to fight back and just take abuse on his chin and just turn the other chin and turn the other face and just move away. But also they were seen as weak and timid, whereas black people were seen as strong and they would fight back. So you didn't hear about black bashing, you heard about Paki bashing because we were an easy target. So, and that's what my parents also told us to do, is always never answer back. But all that did, in my view, and that was born by me changing my behavior to see what would happen, is that it just encourages bullies. So I decided to put a stop to that on the school bus when I was about 16, 17. So there was a skinhead who used to get on the bus and just abuse me and write NF right next to me and then walk off. And then I changed that one summer by going to the gym. And I became a lot bigger. And then for some reason I never got abuse from him. And he stopped. And it taught me a really important lesson. And which is a lesson I always teach to my children now, is you don't take a step back when you're faced with bullies. And you certainly don't take a step back when you're faced with racism. When you grow up with those activities on a daily basis, and that sense of, sometimes it was dread, sometimes it was fear, there was always negative feelings, Simon. So you never felt quite relaxed, especially out of your own comfort zone. So it meant, as a young adult and growing up, if I was in a new environment, I was always very much on edge, thinking, am I going to be accepted? Who's going to say something first? And how am I going to respond? So I'm always on the defensive. So it makes you quite defensive, not angry as such, but defensive, and then it's difficult to open up. And then people say, why have you always got a scowl on your face? I've got a scowl on my face because I'm on edge. I feel, even when I went to university, they say, why have you got that scowl on? Well, because frankly, I don't know how you're going to react to me. If I go to a club, if I go to a pub, it's something that it's ingrained in you, because you're just waiting. And that's a horrible feeling in a way, because your adrenaline is always high because you're waiting for the next issue to arise. You don't realize it. I think this is when you reflect on when things happen later on with your health, and you have a much better understanding what is stress. You've got no idea growing up that you're actually stressed all the time and anxious. You just feel this is what happens. So I felt growing up at school, and I'm always having to prove myself. I always had a pain or some sort of angst in my stomach, and that is stress. You learn later on that is you being anxious and stressed. So every day for God knows how many years, of course, if you have that, you're going to have issues growing up later on in life. Well, you look back on it, at the time you never thought it was traumatic. It was just, things happen and you have to deal with them on a daily basis. But not panic, but I guess what I learned was moving out of Birmingham. So holidays, for example, we didn't have many holidays because my father used to work all 7 days a week. However, the maximum he could afford we'd go 5 days on a little trip. So, for example, we'd go to Bournemouth, or we went to Eastgate, not Eastgate. Where was it? Eastbourne, rather, or Brighton. But we'd have to catch, or Torquay. These are our big holidays, 5 days. But we'd always have to catch the train, and that was always stressful because you would be with Joe Public. So I can remember one such journey, which will, that's etched in my memory as a nightmare, never to be forgotten. We were in those days on the train. You won't see that now, Simon, but you won't see that now. But you have individual carriages. So you have a bench there and bench there, and then the doors shut, and then you have the train was filled with those. So the four of us were in this one carriage, and during the journey there was this group of boys, and they saw that there was 4 Indian people in this carriage, and so they decided to have a field day of abusing us. And whereas I felt a lot of anger, and I was trying to I would have loved my father to have done something about these boys. But all my father told me to look the other way and look at the window, away from them. So all I could hear was abuse and packy this and imitating what we're supposed to speak like, which is rather ironic. However, I had to listen to that for hours. They didn't go away. They kept coming back. It almost, I didn't cry. I didn't want to show them how upset I was. I was really angry. Feelings of bitterness. I wanted to really get my own back on them, but I wasn't allowed to say anything or do anything. I found that that was torment, that was torture. And I relived that moment time and time again whenever I hear that sort of abuse in the street. That train journey comes back to me. When you're sitting on that train journey, you have time to think. That anger, it made me make some decisions that probably affected how I treat other people and my attitude when I felt I was being treated unfairly. And I was always going to be different from my father after that train journey. I was never ever going to accept that if I had the opportunity, if I had an option, and clearly I did at school when my father wasn't with me, I was never ever going to tolerate that sort of behaviour towards me. And growing up, it's made me a lot more vocal. Turning the other cheek was never going to be an option for me when there's injustice. And I feel that now, even with other people, if I see, and that's how I behaved at school. And obviously I wasn't as well as being brown people being abused, Jewish people were also abused. And to this day, I've got a very close friend who still talks about the times I helped him out at school because he was being bullied for being Jewish. And no one else in the class would stand up for him except me. And he remembers that 40 years later. But that's how I feel. That's a value. Stand up for those people who don't have a voice, who get picked on and bullied. I don't think you should accept it. And that's what I decided.
So do you think it was a good experience to have? Do you think in that it helped you stand up for those that...
The experience was positive insofar as it helped me shape my values. So I can take a positive from that experience and help me to decide what I stood for and who I am in one aspect. So I can thank those boys for that. However, I have to say there are negative consequences as well from that journey, because then it made me even more, not cynical, defensive. So you build up a barrier around yourself when you meet people, because you're always wary of how they view you. So instead of being open and welcoming when I meet new people, for many years I was quite defensive and closed, and rather apprehensive. It made me go into my shell, lack confidence, because you always think the worst is going to happen, and which is what I always felt. I felt I was going to be rejected, or I was going to be abused, I was going to have some issue to deal with, so it always puts you on edge. So from that perspective, it was a really bad experience. Did it alter my relationship with my father, that journey? That's an interesting question I ask myself. It will, in fact, not really, because all it did was cement other aspects of his philosophy, which made me realize we were very different. That generation and my generation, and you know, the history bears that out. In 1979, I think, you had the Southall riots. Basically, there was a massive pub which was used by skinheads, and it was surrounded by Sikh people and Punjabis who decided they'd had enough of being bullied, and they basically attacked the pub with those skinheads inside it, and the police had to be brought in. But typical, instead of the Indians being seen as standing up for themselves, they were seen as the aggressors, whereas all they were doing was saying we've had enough and we don't want any more of this abuse. But that was a really important turning point in society, actually, because people started to look up and say, yeah, and especially the Indian community, saying, well, we've had enough, we're not going to take any more of this shit.